I had been working for a private logistics firm for about 6 months when they assigned me to the dead zone. That's what the other guys called the storage yard out in the high desert of Nevada. It was a sprawling Tanaka graveyard for decommissioned heavy machinery and shipping containers that hadn't been opened in a decade. The nearest town was 40 miles of cracked asphalt away, and cell service died the moment you turned off the main highway. The setup was simple. I had a small, reinforced cabin at the front gate and a beat-up pickup truck for perimeter patrols. There was one other guard on the opposite end of the yard, stationed in a similar hut near the secondary exit. His name was Marcus. Marcus was an older guy, a veteran who didn't say much over the radio unless he had to. We'd check in every hour. Just a quick all clear to make sure the desert heat or the crushing silence hadn't gotten to us. The yard was surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with razor wire. But the desert has a way of making you feel like fences are just a suggestion. The wind would howl through the empty containers, creating these low, moaning sounds that made it feel like the yard was breathing. We had a few motion sensor lights, but they were temperamental, flickering on whenever a tumbleweed or a coyote drifted too close. One night, the wind completely died down. The air became heavy and unnaturally still. I was sitting in my cabin, staring at the grainy monitors that showed the dark gaps between the rows of rusted cranes and excavators. Marcus came over the radio. His voice was different, tighter. He asked if I was seeing the glimmer on the north side. I checked the north quad cameras. At first, there was nothing but shadows. Then, I saw it. It wasn't a flashlight, and it wasn't a fire. It was a faint, pulsating luminescence, like something glowing beneath the surface of the sand, just outside the fence line. It moved with a strange, liquid rhythm, drifting toward the secondary gate where Marcus was stationed. I told Marcus to stay inside and keep his door locked. I'd seen enough weird stuff out in the desert to know that curiosity was a liability. But Marcus was convinced it was someone using a chemical light to signal. He told me he was going to the fence line to check it out. I yelled at him over the radio, telling him it wasn't worth the paperwork, but he'd already clicked off. I watched the monitor for his station. I saw his flashlight beam cut through the dark as he stepped out of his hut. He walked toward the glow, which had now stopped moving. It sat there, pulsing in the dark like a heartbeat. Marcus reached the fence. He stood there for a long time, his back to the camera. Then, he did something that made my blood run cold. He didn't just look at the light. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, and began unlocking the gate. I screamed into the radio for him to stop, but he didn't even flinch. He pushed the gate open and stepped out into the open desert, walking straight toward that pulsating glow. As soon as his feet hit the sand outside the perimeter, the light vanished. It didn't fade. It just blinked out of existence. Marcus kept walking. He didn't turn his flashlight on. He just marched into the blackness until the infrared on the camera couldn't pick him up anymore. I sat there, frozen, for 20 minutes. I kept calling his name over the radio, but all I got was the low, rhythmic hum of static. Finally, the radio clicked. There was no talking, just the sound of heavy, wet breathing. Then, a voice that sounded like Marcus, but lacked any of his gravelly tone, said, "It's much cooler out here." Then the line went dead. I didn't go to find him. I locked my cabin door, drew the steel shutters, and sat with my back against the wall, holding my sidearm until the sun peeked over the horizon. When the relief shift arrived, we searched the north quad. The gate was standing wide open. Marcus's radio was sitting in the sand, 20 feet outside the fence. There were no footprints leading away from it, just a circular patch of sand that had been fused into glass, still warm to the touch. I quit that morning. I didn't even wait for my final paycheck. I moved back to the city, took a job at a bright, crowded shopping mall. But sometimes, when the mall goes quiet at night, I hear a faint, rhythmic hum in the ventilation, the same heartbeat rhythm of that light in the desert. A few years later, I took a job at an old shipyard on the coast. It was supposed to be a dry post, no high-value cargo, just watching over a fleet of rusting trawlers, waiting for the scrapyard. I worked with a guy named Elias. Elias was younger, always on his phone, always complaining about how boring the job was. One night, a thick sea fog rolled in, so dense you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Our cameras were useless. The monitors just showed a wall of gray. We had to rely on our ears. Around mid-shift, we started hearing a sound coming from the water. It was a rhythmic tapping, like someone hitting the hull of one of the ships with a hammer. Elias thought it was just the tide moving the debris, but the tapping started to move. It went from the water to the dock, then up onto the concrete. It was moving toward our office. I told Elias to stay put, but he was convinced it was some local kids trying to mess with us. He grabbed his heavy-duty lantern and stepped out into the fog. I watched him disappear into the gray mist. Within seconds, his lantern was just a dim, yellow smudge in the dark. I heard him shout, "Hey, who's there?" There was no reply, only that tapping sound, which had stopped the moment he spoke. Then I heard a splash, a heavy, wet sound, followed by the sound of something being dragged across the gravel. I grabbed my radio and called for Elias. No response. I stepped to the door, peering into the fog. I could see his lantern sitting on the ground about 50 feet away. It was upright, still shining, but Elias was nowhere to be seen. As I stared at the lantern, a shape began to form in the fog behind the light. It was tall to be human and incredibly thin. It didn't have a face. Whose the smoked pale surface that reflected the yellow glow of the lantern. It was standing perfectly still, draped in what looked like rotting fishing nets. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I slowly backed into the office and bolted the door. I heard the tapping start again. This time, it was right on the other side of the door. Tap, tap, tap. It was followed by a voice that sounded exactly like Elias, whispering through the cracks in the wood. "It's cold in the water. Let me in. It's so cold." I stayed in that office until the sun burned the fog away. When the police arrived, they found Elias's lantern, but the ground around it was soaked in seawater, even though the dock was 30 feet above the tide line. They never found Elias. They found a few strands of old, salt-crusted netting caught in the doorframe of my office. But that was it. My final experience happened just last year. I was working at a high-end residential construction site in the hills. The owners were a wealthy couple who were building a sprawling modern fortress. It was mostly concrete and glass, tucked away in a private canyon. The site was supposedly haunted by the workers who had built the original road in the 20s, but I never believed in that stuff. I was more worried about copper thieves. I had a dog with me for this job, a German shepherd named Bear. Bear was fearless, a retired police dog who'd seen it all. One night, Bear started growling at the master bedroom on the 3rd floor. The house was still a skeleton of beams and floorboards, so you could see straight through most of it. There shouldn't have been anyone up there. I shined my light up, but the beam just hit the raw concrete. Bear's hackles went up, and he backed away from the house, winning a sound I'd never heard him make. Suddenly, the interior work lights, which were on a timer and should have been off, flickered on all at once. Through the massive glass windows of the 3rd floor, I saw a woman. She was wearing a high-end evening gown, completely out of place for a construction site. She was standing in the center of the unfinished room, staring out at the canyon. I thought she was the owner. maybe coming back early from a trip. I called out to her, apologizing for the dog. She didn't turn around. She slowly raised her hand and pointed toward the basement. Then, the lights cut out. I felt a cold breeze rush past me. Even though there was no wind that night, I went to the basement stairs, thinking maybe there was a gas leak or something she was trying to warn me about. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, I shined my light around. The basement was a labyrinth of foundation walls. In the far corner, I saw a small, hand-dug hole in the dirt floor. Sitting next to the hole was a pair of vintage leather shoes and a rusted locket. I opened the locket. Inside was a photo of the woman I'd seen on the 3rd floor, but the photo looked like it was from the 1940s. Beneath the photo, scratched into the gold, were the words, "Don't let them finish the floor." I looked up at the ceiling, the underside of the 1st floor, and realized the concrete they'd poured was unusually thick. I didn't stay to find out what was buried in that foundation. I took Bear, got in my truck, and drove until I hit the city lights. The company called me the next day, furious that I'd abandoned my post. I told them what I saw, and they laughed. They told me the previous guard had said the exact same thing before he disappeared. I don't work security anymore. I work in a warehouse now, under bright fluorescent lights, with 20 other people around me at all times. People ask why I don't want a higher-paying night gig. I just tell them I've had enough of the quiet, because in the quiet, things start to find you. And